Hey, Tim.
Hey, Rich, how are you?
Good. I'm Rich Lowry with National Review.
I am Tim Noah, and I think last time we blogged heads, I was Tim Noah of Slate Magazine, but now I am Tim Noah of The New Republic.
I think you had I think we did one when you'd made the shift, and I believe you had the startling revelation for our viewers that Jonathan Chait had 2 couches in his office. Is that right?
That's right. I did show off my couches, yes. That's true. I had forgotten that. And today I am talking to you not from the New Republic's offices, but from my bunker at home. Where right behind me is just so the viewers don't ever let it get too far from their mind that I have a book coming out this spring called The Great Divergence, and behind me actually is a Xerox of the cover. So
good for you.
We'll try and keep that in view as much as possible. My publisher will be very happy about that, although I actually can't because then my head is in the wrong place. Anyway, yes, I have a book about income inequality coming out in the spring.
Very topical. And, you must have been happy with the president kind of Occupy Wall Street and then the president setting it up for you. A nice news hook for your book.
I know, yes, that's very, very nice. But actually, the first thing I want to talk about is Twitter. I need some Twitter tips from you because I joined Twitter last night, actually.
Welcome. Oh, really? It's that recent? Wow.
Because my feeling until then, and I think I still feel this way, is that Twitter is a thing of the devil. Nonetheless, I felt I could not resist. I could not resist the crowd, and I joined last night. Now, the first thing that happened was that my email filled with about 10,000 emails.
Yeah, you got to put the notification on some email you don't use or block it or something.
Right. I felt a little bit like Mickey Mouse in The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Which I guess would be that's an excellent kind of conservative conceit for what liberals are like. Mickey Mouse and The Sorcerer's Apprentice.
I guess so. I'll use that now.
Yes, absolutely. It's yours. It's yours. Anyway, I did sort of feel like I was looking at my email, boom, 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 and suddenly everything was. Anyway, so I can fix that on my settings. Can I fix that on my? Do I fix that on Twitter or on my email?
I'm not a Twitter expert, so I think on Twitter you can have them. I don't know. I can't remember how I fixed it. Whether I just sent them all to junk or blocked them all, or what. But Twitter is an extremely useful tool used in moderation because there is a tendency. It has a tendency just to suck away.
Well, I worry about that, and I also worry about turning into one of those people who kind of reports his every bowel movement on Twitter, and there is a really sort of serious kind of narcissism problem with Twitter that I feel I'm going to struggle to resist because who doesn't love themselves, right?
But if you follow the right people, it is literally the best news feed in the world. And I feel as though when there's something big going on, like a debate, we're talking in the morning of yet another Republican debate, I feel as though I wouldn't really know what's happening in the debate unless I was watching it and following it on Twitter, because you get so many insightful comments, so many, when a factual matter comes up, you'll instantly see links evaluating it. So it's a really valuable tool. And sometimes I wish I didn't have to do anything else and I could just tweet and follow people on Twitter.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I do worry that it's a black hole, that not only as a spouter of nonsense, but also as a reader of other people's nonsense, that I might actually sort of lose whole work days at a clip. But I've actually through a friend, my friend Dana Stevens, who's Slate's film critic, actually helped my son decide what college to go to. He was trying to decide whether he wanted to go to Columbia or Brown, and she put the question before her Twitter followers. He was interested in the film programs at both places, and kind of immediately received all sorts of really useful tips from people who had studied film at one place or the other. It's an incredible sort of crowdsourcing tool.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can imagine all sorts of repertorial uses for it. Anyway, I realize I am.
Well, so welcome, but you need to say what your Twitter handle is.
Oh, my Twitter handle is Timothy Noah 1. The upside to being the last guy who joins Twitter is that you immediately acquire a gazillion followers, because since everybody is already on Twitter, they retweet you and immediately you get followers really quickly. That's the upside. The downside is that you increase the chance that some fraud has come along and grabbed your handle.
Well, just feel sorry for the poor Tim Noah 2 out there who's going to sign up months after you.
Right, but there's a Timothy Noah out there who is either a squatter or a more annoying still, someone else who's actually named Timothy Noah. And I've had this problem actually all my life with Tim Noah, which is not my byline, but which is how most people refer to me, because there's, for my entire professional life, there has been a children's entertainer in Seattle named Tim Noah, who is, among other things, a real domain hog. And so he's always been a very early adapter, and so he has seized all of the desirable domains before it even occurs to me to look at them. TimNoah.com.
Well, I'll have to tell my wife this, because she is, if God willing, we have children. She is obsessed with finding a name that no one else in the universe has. And I was kind of making fun of her for this, but I'll tell her your experience, and she'll feel validated in this search she always undertakes whenever she has a brainstorm.
Well, this is a real problem on the web. The doppelganger. Have you got a doppelganger?
There are Richard Lowrys out there. Well, there was Rich Lowry, the famous 999 guy, but he spells it differently. There's a Russian historian, Richard Lowry, who I believe, if I'm not mistaken, spells it the right way. But I haven't bumped into any domain or Twitter handle problems.
My doppelganger actually even looks a little bit like me, which is really sort of disturbing, and I have on occasion been mistaken for him. I remember once when Slate was owned by Microsoft, I went to the Microsoft offices in Redmond, and a beautiful, slender, blonde receptionist said, "I'm Tim Noah," and she said, "Oh, Tim Noah!" And of course, I was already saying, "Yes, I write this little column, Chatterbox. Perhaps you've heard of it." And but the next words out of her mouth were, "I loved you when I was a kid,"
Yeah, that's funny.
which was deflating in more ways than one. So anyway, yeah, the doppelganger problem is a problem on Twitter. But I am Timothy Noah 1. For anybody who wants to follow my tweets, and do you tweet every day? I mean, is it?
No, I do the self-promotional tweets. I'll tweet out my columns, and then maybe not every day, but most days I'll have a comment or two. And then when there's a major news event, I will often tweet obsessively throughout it. The debate tonight, for instance, I'll probably do 50 tweets just during the debate. Just anything that occurs to me that is interesting, I'll tweet out there. So I'm not a terribly active tweeter, except for when big things.
Now, do you have any tips on how to handle your internal censor? Because I worry about that. I'm one of those people. Well, we all are really. Who on any given day, all of us, every one of us, says 5 or 6 things that are a little bit naughty, and the challenge is to keep from putting those 5 or 6 things on Twitter and announcing them to the entire world. How do you handle that?
Just try to give it a second thought. don't push the button until you've at least thought about it for 10 seconds. Would be my advice. And then never tweet angry.
Never tweet angry.
When you have exchanges with people, because it's the worst thing in the world when you get in a Twitter war with someone where you're both in a rage and assaulting each other, and you think you're really making devastating points, and your rapid-fire tweets are just showing up in everyone else's Twitter feed. I think, what's wrong with both of these people? They're crazy.
Well, that's good advice. Yeah, no, all these people are egging me. I said I will never use this in anger, and then of course I got 14 million tweets back from people saying, "Oh, please use it in anger. Please use it in anger."
Yeah.
So it really is. It's an evil medium that way, and but anyway, I will try to use it with the proper care that it clearly requires. So what is your Twitter handle?
Rich Lowry, at Rich Lowry.
You got
Very
nice
simple.
and clean. That's good.
Yes.
All right. Well, moving on. I understand that National Review, like just about every conservative I know, is waking up in the middle of the night like Frank Sinatra and the Manchurian Candidate, screaming at the prospect that Newt Gingrich will be the Republican nominee. Is that a pretty fair description both of National Review and of the conservative movement generally?
I think that is that's right. We we don't want to make very certain sounding predictions about how he would fare in a general election, because you just never know. I mean, no one would have predicted his comeback and amazing surge ahead, but he'd certainly be a high-risk proposition in a general election, and for us, a high-risk proposition with not much reward if he were
right. Hard to know what the
because
risk is from your point of view. The greater risk might be that he would actually win.
Well, yeah, and you just don't know what he would be like as president. All you would know is that it would be likely very unpredictable. And if you're a conservative and you just basically want this consensus agenda that's been forged between what House Republicans have done and the positions basically all the presidential candidates have taken, if you just want that to happen, there's no guarantee it'll happen with Newt, because you don't know when he's going to have a brainstorm, when he's going to want to do a grand Nixon to China gesture. So he's a tremendously appealing figure in a lot of ways, and I understand why Republicans are, and some Republicans are entranced with him at the moment. And I disagree a little bit with some of the theories for why he has this appeal. My friend Pete Wayner said, it's because the establishment doesn't like him, that's why people like him. Ross Douthat had a typically brilliant column last weekend saying it's this revenge fantasy against Obama where they want to prove that Obama's not that smart because we got the smarter guy who's going to beat him in debates. And certainly the idea of that is alluring to a lot of Republicans.
Joan Didion once described Newt as she had a very snotty but rather scathing description of him as a garrulous, small-town autodidact bore. I think.
Yeah, that's pretty harsh. But I think that if you look at the internals of these polls lately, people see him as the most experienced guy. They see him as the best able to handle a foreign crisis. They see him as the best prepared to be commander-in-chief. So I think based on the debates, where his performance has been genuinely impressive, they're concluding he's best suited to be president. So it's not any of these theories that I just was reciting from Pete or Ross. It's really they think he'd be a good president. So I think they're wrong in a lot of their judgments about him, and I think over time, when they get to know him a little bit better, they'll probably agree more with me. But I could be wrong, and I think they're making a rational evaluation based on the evidence that they have in front of their eyes in these debates, which so far, they're the most direct and credible source of information about these candidates, right? Rick Perry can do his ads, and he acts and performs brilliantly in his ads.
Right.
You know, he seems so appealing, and there's never a slip up, right? He reads the script perfectly. But then why are you going to believe that when you see him in the debates? And I think there's a little bit of that going on with Newt right now. You can have all the opinion makers piling on him, and I do think he's leveling off, maybe dipping a little bit already.
You guys ought to be able to finish him off. I mean, it seems to me, you know, after a couple of weeks of this drip, 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 we really can't stand the guy. He's going to come down to the balls, isn't he?
I doubt his staying power, but we'll see.
Question is it going to be you guys who kill him off, or is it going to be Newt who kills himself off?
Well, a couple things. One, as just to finish that thought, you know, George Will can pile on him, but if he performs in a mature and responsible-seeming way in the debates, who are people going to believe? You know, are they going to believe the George Will column? Or are they going to believe what seems to be the evidence in front of their eyes? So I do think surfacing some of this information about Newt that people may not know. You know, there's been big emphasis on the Freddie Mac payments, and you know how he just became a Washington player is going to hurt him. And focusing on the changing positions over the years, which is a little different than Romney. Romney changed in one fell swoop when he moved from the Massachusetts to the national environment. Newt will change, you know, from week to week. 2 different positions on TARP, 2 different positions on Libya, 3, 4, 5, 6 different positions on the Ryan plan. That stuff will hurt him.
You might say Mitt is an opportunist, but Newt is both opportunist and flake.
Well, the way I would put it is Mitt's changes were probably a product of very rational calculation. Newt's changes are and a cautious temperament on the part of Mitt, and just sort of wanting to be at the center of you know, the party wherever it is in Massachusetts or nationally. Newt, it's really the changes are changes of passion and just go to kind of a jagged temperament, and a very the very opposite of a cautious
zany, as Romney has labeled, which is
wacky.
Zany is did he say wacky or zany?
No, he said zany.
Zany is actually a great word to use, because it says that he's a flake, but it says it in this kind of almost affectionate way, so that you don't sound mean when you're calling somebody zany. Although at the same time, if somebody pauses and thinks for a second, they will realize that zany really is not a characteristic we want in a president.
Yeah, it's a very 1950s kind of word. Did you see the movie Blast from the Past?
No.
Do you remember that? It was about 10 years ago. It was about a family during the Cuban Missile Crisis. They thought there was a nuclear attack imminent on the United States, so they retreated to their bomb shelter, and they thought the United States had just been devastated by nuclear weapons, and they couldn't emerge without being poisoned, so they lived down there for 30 years, and then raised their nice son, and suddenly, for some reason, they realized, actually, you know, it's okay, you can go up. So this guy is released back into the world, who has these kind of late 1950s, early 1960s mores and habits and ways of looking at the world, and then hilarity ensues.
Right.
And
a central text of the conservative
today,
movement.
and that's a lot like Mitt Romney.
That's a central text of the conservative movement.
Yeah, so yeah, but that's exactly the feel. Don't you think you get from Mitt Romney, where he sort of skipped a couple decades?
I do. Yeah, just the hair alone sort of expresses that. But yes, he is a. It is kind of amazing to think that this was a guy who actually went to college during the 1960s. And in fact, sort of fun fact about Mitt Romney, his freshman advisor at Stanford was David, what's his name? Joan Baez's husband. Do you know who I'm talking about? The anti-war guy, David, what was his name? Famous Vietnam dissident. I think he went to jail to protest against the draft, and married Joan Baez, and then became a journalist. And he was Mitt Romney's freshman advisor, but obviously none of it really rubbed off on Mitt. Although Mitt, the other thing about Mitt that sort of people tend to forget is that his father was, you know, we call those people moderate Republicans today, but in those days we called them liberal Republicans. If George Romney were practicing politics today, he would really fit very comfortably into the mainstream of the Democratic Party, wouldn't he?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about George Romney, but I know you did this post on the kind of distant echoes we have of Rockefeller Republicans with Newt Romney. There I go. Michelle Bachman's had her. With Newt Gingrich being a very prominent example, which people forget.
Right, but he began life as a Rockefeller delegate at the 1968 Democratic Convention. When he was a graduate student, he was an ardent Rockefeller Republican, and yeah, what I said in the blog post was that it's 3 of the 4 most important Republicans of the moment began life as Rockefeller Republicans: Newt Gingrich, Mitt Romney, by proxy through his father, and also as, I guess by then you didn't call them Rockefeller Republicans, but he was a very moderate governor of Massachusetts. And the third, strangely enough, is Mitch McConnell. I only recently sort of discovered that reading Jeffrey Cabasservice's forthcoming book about moderate Republicans, that he began his career as a kind of a Rockefeller Republican. Did you know that?
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, he's really covered his tracks. The fourth, of course, is John Boehner, who has not put any time in as a Rockefeller Republican. But my hypothesis is that an ex Rockefeller Republican is liable to be more extremist than a regular old extremist because he has something to prove. He has bona fides to establish, and I think we definitely see that in Mitt's case and McConnell's case. Newt is a harder case because there's so much music going on in his head that doesn't really have a lot to do with political movements, but he did have to establish his bona fides as a conservative. He's always sort of talked more conservative than he really was. Would you say that's a fair judgment of Gingrich?
I think that's right, but I don't know whether that's a calculated matter or just a matter of his personality and his tendency to be just grandiose and incendiary on almost everything. It's just his way of expressing. When he asks for toast, from Calista in the morning, it's probably some grand ideological struggle. But Tim, is there any part of you or Democrats that you detect that are at all worried? Let's say Newt gets a nomination, that Newt could be a little more interesting or hard to pin down than the average Republican, and therefore perhaps surprisingly difficult. Let's say Newt kind of emphasizes that Brooksian side of him that had David Brooks the other day praising his substance, although saying, and this was a great twist of the dagger, saying that the problem is that Newt believes more in government than David does himself. Right. But is there you detect any of that worry, or just Democrats are licking?
I have to say, I'm speaking for myself. I am mostly licking my chops. Although I don't think, I agree with Barney Frank when he said that he has not lived a sufficiently blameless life that Newt Gingrich should be the Republican nominee. It's just it's hard to imagine that we will be that lucky. I think Romney is going to be the nominee. I mean, it's weird to call anybody the presumptive nominee when A, he isn't the front runner, and B, the voting hasn't started yet. But I think Republicans are in a box. I just don't think that there is any alternative to nominating Mitt Romney. So really, it's nothing but politeness that I think keeps most people from calling him the presumptive nominee already.
Well, I probably think the odds are still better than 50% that Romney is the nominee, but I don't think it's impossible that Newt gets nominated, and I don't think it's impossible that there's yet another turn of the worm or two here. I can't explain to you how it actually would happen or what it would be, but I just remember after one of the debates months and months and months ago, and everyone was thinking it was a Romney-Perry race. I remember saying to one of my colleagues, well, I wonder if Newt was pretty good and Santorum was pretty good. I wonder if they could get a little, gust or surge. And my colleagues, no, it's a Perry-Romney race, and now it's not a Perry-Romney race at all, and everyone's kind of convinced it's a Perry-Gingrich race. So I just wouldn't be shocked if it still ends up looking pretty different than it does now. Although we're running out of time.
Still just
3 weeks.
Barely enough time maybe for a Santorum boomlet, particularly if he does well in Iowa, right? He's an Iowa kind of guy. Yeah, he's still 6-8%, but if the attacks on Gingrich begin to tell, they have to go somewhere. Now there are a lot of there are other places they can go. Perry, Bachman still, or Santorum, but Iowa's just going to be fascinating because it's 5 points could make the difference between Romney conceivably finishing first or finishing fifth, which could kill him. It's going to be very hard for him to I just think that would be devastating to his standing in New Hampshire. And if he finishes that low in Iowa and loses New Hampshire, is he, effectively a dead candidate by mid-January? Does this thing look totally different than it does now? And do you really have, I thought it was very notable, George Will last Sunday saying we may need a third candidate, meaning some alternative to Gingrich or Romney. So would you see, again, Republicans in desperation lobbying someone like Jeb Bush to get in? But isn't it pretty inconceivable that Romney's going to lose New Hampshire? I mean, aren't the chances likelier that an asteroid will obliterate the Earth and that Romney will lose in New Hampshire?
No, not at all. I mean, I haven't gone back and looked at the polls from 2008, but he was leading, if memory serves, pretty consistently and solidly until he lost Iowa. And he just finished second in Iowa then, and that weakened him enough for McCain to come up and beat him in New Hampshire and more or less kill off his campaign. He had some chance in Florida, which was the nail in the coffin. But those New Hampshire numbers are very volatile, and they're affected by Iowa. So the doomsday scenario for Mitt, in my mind, always was getting sucked into a fight in Iowa where he couldn't pretend that he's just doing it, half in, half out. We really had to go full throttle in Iowa and lose badly. And that is a scenario that is quite possible still. Well, it's quite more possible now than it has been ever, I guess is the way I'd put it.
Well, what about, we liberals scratch our heads and we ask ourselves, why don't Republicans express any interest in that nice John Huntsman? What is the answer to that question?
Well,
is it just that he's a rat fig for joining the Obama administration? Is that pure?
No, we say in this editorial that he should be considered, but I sort of personally, not speaking collectively for everyone here, I say that through very gritted teeth, because I just find him such an annoying and unappealing personality. And I think if he had run out of the gate I am a conservative, I'm as conservative as the rest of you, look at my record, I want to represent you conservatives, I love what you're about, let's go beat this guy. I don't think the ambassadorship would have been a devastating blow to that kind of case, and in fact you don't really hear about it anymore. I mean, there's so many flaws with all these candidates that a flaw like that I would think, I thought, at the beginning, just made him a non-starter is almost an afterthought. But he did this kind of John Weaver strategy where I'm going to kind of look down my nose at you and I'm going to appeal to the Vogue readers and independents and Democrats basically in New Hampshire, and the rest of you are kooks, which was just the wrong kind of salesmanship, but there's part of him that he was saying things like that even before he was running for president, even before he hired John Weaver. So maybe that's just where he is. But that kind of attitude is just extremely off-putting. Now you have some folks, the blogger Eric Erickson, George Will now saying, well, look at his record, which is just, and maybe we need to consider him again, which is just a function of the weakness of the rest of the field.
Well, but you don't expect it to happen.
It could. I really mean it when I say this is just so volatile and highly unpredictable. If Romney finishes 4th or 5th in Iowa and sinks in New Hampshire, you would think a lot of those votes are going to go to Huntsman. Mm-hmm. So what if Ron Paul wins? If Ron Paul wins Iowa, that's probably good for Romney because then Iowa will probably be discounted, and he can almost finish anywhere he wants in Iowa. But if Gingrich has a narrow victory in Iowa and Romney finishes 4th or 5th, then you could have a big Huntsman Gingrich fight in New Hampshire. And again, it could just look totally different than what it looks like now.
Well, just kind of to return to sort of my first thought here, I mean, it is amazing to me that Harry Reid on the Senate floor yesterday was actually taunting Republicans by referring to Newt Gingrich as the front runner. It was the weirdest thing in the world. He was being cruel by pointing out that Newt Gingrich was the front runner. It's not typically the case that you can torment the other party by pointing out who's winning in the polls.
Yeah, don't use our front runner against him. I missed that. What did he say?
It was about the payroll tax, and he was basically suggesting that he was trying to plant the notion that if there's a government shutdown after Friday, it will be the Republicans' fault, and to kind of tie it in with the government shutdowns of the mid-'90s, he reminded everybody that Newt is back and he is the front runner for president. It was all very artfully done, and
I have trouble believing that of anything that Harry Reid has ever said. But I'll take your word. Tim,
it was artfully conceived. Let me put it that way. The delivery was a little wanting. It's true, but it was an excellent construct, and it was just I was just watching this video thinking I can't believe that that this is a technique to torture Republicans is merely pointing out who their front runner is, but it is. But
Tim, do you want to hit the inequality and the president and the Kansas speech?
Yes, let's talk about the Kansas speech. I liked the Kansas speech. I like this new aggressive, mean Barack Obama. I find myself wishing that he governed a little bit more like he campaigns. I think he's having an impact. I think that he's giving, for the first time in quite a long time, he's giving Republicans kind of a hard time because they're sort of in this box with the extending the payroll tax cut. What is National Review's position on whether the payroll tax cut should be extended?
We're in favor of it because we're in favor, in principle, pretty much of anything that lets people keep more of their earnings and prevents the government from taking money from their paycheck. Now, I understand where Senator Kyle is coming from on this. He points out, why are we going to have a temporary tax cut paid for by permanent tax increases, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But I think that
the Democrats have offered. Then the second vote, the Democrats made their tax increase temporary, and he still was against it.
I've been a little bit out of touch on the payroll debate, so I missed us before we were on. I was sort of looking at your update of everything that happened in the Senate recently. So I think the House is in a pretty good place. I mean, I think it's clever jiu-jitsu politics to force a decision on this Keystone Pipeline, the most shovel-ready project in the nation that the president's kicking the can on solely out of political considerations because he doesn't want to choose between the environmentalist and his union supporters. But I never thought it would be sustainable for Republicans just to oppose a extension of the tax cut outright, and we're glad that they came around on that.
Well, there seems to be some argument back and forth about who's kind of holding the cards right now. Are the Republicans holding the cards because they might be able to force Obama's hand on the Keystone Pipeline, or are the Democrats holding the cards because they, in the form of Harry Reid, are saying we're not going to vote on the government funding bill until we work out this payroll tax business? Who's got the upper hand?
Again, I have to apologize. I have not followed this as close. We've been formulating our Gingrich editorial and taking all the incoming with that. So I think the pipeline is a good issue. As I said, sort of a good wedge. But in terms of the shutdown maneuverings, I just haven't followed it closely enough. And frankly, I have shutdown fatigue. I don't believe in shutdowns. I don't think they're ever going to happen. So there's part of me that I haven't had time to follow it, and part of me just doesn't want to follow it. I'm so bored with shutdowns. But what do you think?
I think the Democrats actually have the upper hand. I think they can basically say, look, I thought Republicans don't like taxes. How come they won't just vote on extending a tax cut? Why do they have to throw in this environmental issue that they know we oppose? Why do we have to bribe Republicans into supporting a tax cut? I think that's a kind of powerful argument for the Democrats to make in this instance. And it puts Republicans in the uncomfortable position of having to explain why the only tax cuts they favor are tax cuts that go to the rich, which is, Kyle has pretty much said outright. And I think that's a politically uncomfortable place for the Republicans to be, which is why Mitch McConnell tried to work out a compromise in the Senate. They had a vote on the McConnell compromise. Not only did most Republicans vote against it, but most of the Republican leadership voted against it. And it was weird.
Well, there has been, and again, I'll make a 30,000 feet observation because I haven't been following the Senate debate closely. There is an odd tendency on the right where some of us have basically gotten us into a position where the only taxes that count somehow are income taxes. And so that's where you get the rhetoric about just only 53% of people paying taxes and 47% of people don't pay taxes, which is true of federal income taxes, but leaves payroll taxes out of the picture, which doesn't make sense because it's a hugely important tax, a hugely regressive tax, and one that working people really feel. So I would think it behooves conservatives to consider this tax with the same sort of skepticism and jaundiced eye as they do every other tax, but they've kind of got themselves into a strange position on this.
Well, there's a point that liberals also seldom observe, which is that liberals, I think, also tend to be more focused on the income tax. And it's interesting because if you look at government from an inequality point of view, the income tax is actually slightly more progressive today than it was 30 years ago. That's not because of, and it's easy to miss that because top rates have come way down. But at the same time, the top rates have come way down. The kind of burden of people at the bottom has been eased so much that the net effect has been for the income tax to become slightly more progressive. Overall, however, government, the sort of overall workings of government have become more regressive over the last 30 years, and that's because of other taxes, including the payroll tax, things like capital gains tax, and it's also to some extent because entitlements have proven to be somewhat regressive because so much of them are aimed at
Yes.
The elderly who have become more affluent.
Yes.
So it's there's not nearly as much of the action happening at the income tax as a lot of us imagine. With the caveat, I would make the caveat that there are lots of different ways to measure income inequality, and it's certainly true that people at top incomes have seen, at the very top, have seen a pretty drastic decrease in their income tax rates in addition to their overall tax rates.
Let me share a thought on the Kansas speech, because I had the exact opposite reaction you did. I found it really poisonous and unconvincing, and what I objected to most was the, I believe, false connection. There's maybe a little very tenuous evidence you can find for it, but the notion that the fact of inequality in itself is reducing mobility and the welfare of people in the bottom fifth, which I think, is that a bird in the background?
Sorry, that's I have a bird clock that my children got me as a gag many years ago.
Well, I love birds, so I was going to be very impressed.
No.
What was I going to say before I was distracted by your
Sorry
bird
about
alarm? Oh, yeah, so, people at the bottom, it's just not true that they're not getting ahead because of inequality. You look at the things that create that stickiness at the bottom, and things like incarceration. It's things like being raised in single-parent households. It's rotten schools. And this just, I wrote a column about this recently and used the example of Peter Orszag. That Peter Orszag goes and makes $2 or $3 million from at Citigroup and merrily joins 1%, has zero effect on people who may be stuck at the bottom fifth in the Bronx, for instance. So I would welcome an effort to really focus on aspiration and mobility and what we need to do to enhance it. But this was just a highly politicized speech that really missed the point entirely on mobility, and pretty deliberately.
Well, I will give you this. I will give you that the inequality story really is not about what has happened to the bottom fifth. It was lousy being poor in 1979. It is still lousy being poor in 2011. For a while there, it was actually slightly less lousy because of the tightening labor market for home health care workers and some other lower paid jobs. I think the recession that drove so many people into poverty that was no longer the case. But the inequality story of the last 30 years doesn't have a lot to do with the poor. It has to do with the position of the middle class relative to the wealthy. And so I think you can fault Obama for not sort of focusing enough attention on that. If you're talking about inequality and the disturbing trend, I think it's great that the President of the United States is talking about it at some length. It's a huge problem in our society that hasn't gotten discussed much by politicians over the last 30 years. But this is a trend that affects the middle class, and it isn't a trend that has affected the people in the bottom fifth, which is not to say that life is terrific for people in the bottom fifth. It's not, and particularly the mobility numbers are especially sort of tragic for people at the bottom. But just the straight up income inequality issue is a middle class issue, and for that reason, actually, kind of ripe for being politicized. Because even though the middle class is shrinking, we still have a pretty big middle class in the United States, and this is something that they ought to be interested in.
Well, even there, Tim, and unfortunately I have to run in a minute, but because we probably have an hour-long conversation just on this, but even there, how does someone getting very rich on Wall Street affect the welfare of the middle class? And are you going to, what government policy is going to address that? Are you going to take more of Peter Orszag's earnings in order not to give it to poor people, but to give it just to middle class people? How would this equalizing redistribution, if that's the ultimate agenda, how would it?
Well, overall, what the government does, the government is about 25% less redistributive today than it was in 1979. This was not a socialist country in 1979. So if you were kind of to restore that level of government redistribution, you would see some ameliorating effect just there. There's also some discussion that the evidence for this is tentative, but there is some discussion about a shift of profits away from labor towards capital, which is more or less what you would expect with the decline of the labor movement. And this is actually some of the best documentation on this comes from Wall Street banks, which have been sort of noting the trend. Now you could argue that in some cases that it's the same person. Okay? If I'm a worker, then I get a salary, but I also have a 401k. But in the grand scheme of things, the stockholders in the United States, people who have money in the stock market or in money markets, they skew pretty wealthy overall. So anyway, you're right, this could be an hour-long conversation. You guys ran a very good piece, actually, recently on inequality, I was pleased to see, by
Scott Winship.
Yes, by Scott Winship, who is very smart and has a lot of interesting things to say about this.
All right, Tim, on that note, it's been nice talking to you.
Good talking to you, and till next time.
All right, take care, Tim.
You too.
All right, enjoyed it.